lost loved ones and those who were injured in this tragic crash. It is the mission of the NTSB to ensure the safety of the traveling public. I'm sorry to say that while we've made progress in the safety of aviation, rail, and marine, highway safety has not seen the same gains. Over 40,000 people die on our highways every year, and that's unacceptable. They're more than just the statistics. There are mothers and our fathers and our friends. There are co-workers. We have an obligation to do better. The NTSB recommendation for highway safety focus on the fact that we all have a role to play in making highways safer for everybody, from regulators to vehicle manufacturers to road designers to road users. We all need to work together to reduce the risk and injury or death. It takes all of us working together to improve safety in this country. No one can do it alone. We need everyone to be engaged in this process. The NTSB has put together a multidisciplinary team to investigate every aspect of this crash. The team, led by investigator in charge Kenny Bragg, a senior highway safety investigator, has made progress in a number of areas. I will turn it over to him now to give you more details. Kenny.
Thank you, Vice Chair Brown. Today, we were able to document the scene using an unmanned aerial system. It allows us to rapidly document the scenes with the 3D mapping and to get a full scope of the sequence of events. Since the crash occurred on I-35, it allows investigators to capture this documentation with minimal disruption to the public. We know that the crash occurred in a temporary work zone inside the highway expansion project on I-35. The overnight lane closure was scheduled to occur from 9 p.m. until 3 a.m. The work started at milepost 245, reducing 3 lanes into 1. At the time of the crash, a traffic alert started to queue. The crash occurred at milepost 245.4. According to the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, the truck that initiated the crash sequence was registered to for hire carrier ZBN Transport LLC out of Dallas, Texas. In the coming days, the team will continue to document this temporary work zone, conduct a detailed mechanical inspection of the striking truck, and collect further information from witnesses. We'll also be looking into the truck driver's employment history as a commercial driver, his entire driving history to include crash history and traffic violations, as well as his medical history for factors that may have influenced his driving. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Vice Chairman Brown.
As the schedule ongoing forward, our investigation is ongoing. We are working closely with our partners to gather factual information to expedite our on-scene activities. The party to the investigation are Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, Texas Department of Transportation, and Austin Police Department. We expect to be on the scene for about 7 or 10 days, but we're here as long as it takes. Although we've made good progress today, I want to emphasize it is still early in our investigation phase. Our objective is to find out what happened and why it happened so that we can make recommendations to ensure that it doesn't happen again. Let me reiterate, too, we do not determine the probable cause of the crash while we're here on the scene. We also do not speculate about what have caused this crash. This will be our last and final press briefing in Austin. Our next update is expected to be within the next 30 days. It will be available on our website at ntsb.gov, and we will share it to our X account at NTSB_newsroom. The preliminary report will have a summary of the facts to date, the probable cause, any contributing factors, and our recommendation will be in a final report in about 12 to 24 months. I will now take a few questions. To ask a question, please raise your hand, state your name, and identify your affiliate.
I know that you can't really say anything more about the probable cause while you're investigating, but you did mention earlier about the importance that all of us play in this ecosystem when it comes to managing highway safety. Just whatever you can share based on what you have noticed or observed about what we saw in this tragedy. What part do you think all of us here as Austinites or anyone that takes these important corridors, just based on what you've seen, what part, how do we need to be even more vigilant when we're on the roadways?
The question is, what role can we all play in safety? What part can we take in this role, since I've stated that we all have a part? And I think safety is our #1 priority as the NTSB. So at the end of the day, we have to be responsible for each other. For example, one of the things we want to make sure people are involved in is don't speed, no drinking and driving, be aware of your surroundings, follow the law, don't run a red light. So those are basic things, but there are many more things. We focus on every area when it comes to transportation, not just highway, but rail, also aviation. So, but it takes all of us working together. Kenny, would you want to add to that in terms of safety?
Thank you. I think sometimes that things that we do every day, we tend to lose sight of the importance, but driving is an immense responsibility. So we encourage everyone to think about what they're doing, take their time, and develop good, safe driving habits.
Is there anything you think could be better about I-35 in terms of drivability there?
Well, that's what this investigation is all about. They're doing an investigation. They're focusing on it, and I'm sure that's going to be a part of it. You would like to add to that? Ken?
Grace Reader with the NBC affiliate here in Austin. You said unmanned aerial system. Does that mean drone?
Yes.
And then also you said that the company, the trunking company, was based out of Dallas. Do you know if the person who has been arrested was living in Dallas or was stationed somewhere else?
It's still very early in the investigation, and those details we have not yet confirmed. While we have some idea, we don't want to speculate, so we'll issue that information when we confirm it and determine it to be reliable.
Yes.
Lauren Taylor with CBS Austin News photographer. It was said yesterday you guys have drone footage. Is that going to be available for the media or just to the public in general?
We typically don't release any information that we collect until our investigation is completed, or at least a year until the docket is released. So right now, anyone interested can submit a FOIA request, and when the investigation is completed, we will honor it.
Is there any more information you can share about the victims? Are you sharing any names yet, or anyone injured, or how? Are we sharing how everyone's doing?
The question is, can we share any more information about the victim? Austin Police Department would be able to provide you with that information.
Last question.
How much of an impact did the multiple construction barriers and lack of shoulder space have in contributing to this crash?
The question is, how much, repeat it one more time?
Sorry. How much of an impact did the multiple construction barriers and lack of shoulder space have in contributing to this crash?
The question is, how much has the multiple traffic barriers contribute to this crash?
The design of the work zone in the roadway, that is a definite focus of this comprehensive investigation. Our highway investigator is something that they will gather information on, and when it's time to release information about that, we'll make that available.
Thank you, everyone.
Good afternoon. Eric Weiss with NTSB Media Relations. Today you'll be briefed on the January 29th Midair collision outside Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport. Briefing you today will be NTSB Chairman Jennifer Homendy, as well as IIC, or Investigator in Charge, Bryce Banning, BRICE BANNING.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. Today, we're issuing our preliminary report of the mid-air collision involving a U.S. Army Sikorsky UH-60 Lima, or Black Hawk, and PSA Airlines doing business as American Airlines Flight 5342 over the Potomac River in Washington, D.C. on January 29th. As a reminder, our preliminary reports are just that. They are preliminary. We still have a lot of work to do in this investigation, so the report contains only the facts that we're able to validate and release at this time. If we still have questions on something, or there's an area that we need to do more investigative work on, we're going to do that work, and that takes time. What we're not going to do is release unverified information which would only mislead the public, regulators, and others. Also, since I'm level setting here, this report does not include any analysis. That comes later in our investigation. Right now, we are still in the fact-finding phase of this investigation. I often say that the easiest and quickest part of the investigation is determining what happened. The part that takes longer is the how and why. The NTSB prides itself on being the global leader in accident investigations. We are thorough and we're fact-based. Those facts, the evidence, serve as the foundation for our analysis, our probable cause, our findings, and our safety recommendations. Generally, the preliminary report we're releasing today discusses crew experience in terms of flight hours, the history of the flights, much of which was released in my last press conference, information on the recorders. We still have a lot of work to do in this area as the Black Hawks combined cockpit voice and flight data recorder does not record date information, time information, or helicopter position information. And as I mentioned in the last press conference, there is inconsistency in the data which led us to declare the pressure altitude parameter on the Black Hawk as invalid. We're now in the process of determining whether that may have affected other helicopter systems that used pressure altitude as a data source, such as the altimeters. The report also contains information on the operators, the aircraft involved, air traffic control at the time of the crash, helicopter routes, the airport, emergency response and recovery operations, and the wreckage exams. But what I want to focus on this afternoon is our issuance of a recommendation report that contains 2 urgent safety recommendations to the Federal Aviation Administration, or FAA, concerning the helicopter routes near DCA. Urgent recommendations require immediate action to prevent similar accidents or incidents. When we issue them, we believe a critical safety issue must be addressed without delay. For this investigation, we're reviewing airport operations and prior incidents, including near mid-air collision events. Information gathered from voluntary safety reporting programs and the FAA regarding encounters between helicopters and commercial aircraft near DCA show that from 2011 through 2024, A vast majority of reported events occurred on approach to landing. Initial analysis found that at least one traffic alert and collision avoidance system, or TCAS, resolution advisory was triggered per month from 2011 through 2024 at DCA due to proximity to a helicopter. TCAS resolution advisories, or RAs, unlike traffic advisories, or TAs, are recommended escape maneuvers, for example, climb or descend, level off. Keep in mind that a TA is issued when the intruding aircraft is about 20 seconds from the closest point of approach, or 0.3 nautical miles, whichever occurs first. They are advisory. RAs indicate a collision threat and require immediate action. In over half of the encounters we reviewed, again from 2011 through 2024, the helicopter may have been above the route altitude restriction. 2/3 of the events occurred at night. We then reviewed commercial operations at DCA and found that between October 2021 and December 2024, there were a total of 944,179 commercial operations at DCA. These are instrument flight rules, or IFR, departures or arrivals. Again, that number is 944,179 commercial operations at DCA. During that time, again, October 2021 through December 2024, there were 15,214 occurrences, or close proximity events, between commercial airplanes and helicopters, in which there was a lateral separation distance of less than 1 nautical mile and vertical separation of less than 400 feet. There were 85 recorded events that involved a lateral separation of less than 1,500 feet and vertical separation of less than 200 feet. As a result of the accident, U.S. Department of Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy took swift action to ensure safety and restrict helicopter traffic from operating over the Potomac River at DCA until March 31st. And I want to commend him for that and commend the work of the FAA to also take swift action. As that deadline nears, we remain concerned about the significant potential for a future midair collision at DCA, which is why we are recommending a permanent solution today. On the chart to my right is a cross-section of the airspace that extends from runway 33's center line, spanning from the runway to the east bank of the Potomac River. The figure shows the separation distance that would exist according to FAA charts, with a helicopter on Route 4 and an airplane descending on the glide slope to runway 33. As stated in my last press conference and confirmed by the FAA, helicopter routes established by the FAA have no lateral boundaries, and the Baltimore-Washington helicopter route chart includes no warning for helicopters to operate a defined distance from the shoreline. So this shaded region right here represents an approximation of the area in which helicopters could be flown. We know that the helicopter on the accident date was not in this area. It was to the west. But at the maximum altitude here of just 200 feet, a helicopter operating over the eastern shoreline of the Potomac River would have just 75 feet of vertical separation from an airplane approaching runway 33. 75 feet. That distance decreases if the helicopter is operated farther from the shoreline. And again, this helicopter, the Black Hawk, was operated farther to the west. We've determined that the existing separation distances between helicopter traffic operating on Route 4 and aircraft landing on runway 33 are insufficient and pose an intolerable risk to aviation safety by increasing the chances of a mid-air collision at DCA. Let me repeat that. They pose an intolerable risk to aviation safety. We're therefore recommending today that the FAA permanently prohibit operations on helicopter Route 4 between Haines Point and the Wilson Bridge when runways 15 and 33 are being used for departures and arrivals at DCA. Now, we recognize that a total closure of helicopter 4 between Haines Point and the Wilson Bridge during times when runway 15 and runway 33 are in use would restrict a vital aviation corridor used for law enforcement activity, Coast Guard patrols, and continuity of government operations. Additionally, mandating that controllers hold helicopters in place north or south of DCA while airplanes are operating on runway 15 and runway 33 has the potential to increase risk by adding to controller workload. So we are also recommending that the FAA designate an alternative helicopter route that can be used to facilitate travel between Haines Point and the Wilson Bridge when that segment of Route 4 is closed. From here, our team has a lot of work to do. We'll conduct a number of simulations, including in the Black Hawk simulator, CRJ simulator, ATC tower simulator, all using the accident inputs and conditions. We'll conduct a comprehensive visibility study for the CRJ flight, the Black Hawk flight, and tower visibility, all under night conditions. We will conduct additional interviews in helicopter operations and in air traffic control, and the team will continue to examine the radio altimeters, the barometric altimeters, and additional electronics. With that, I will take questions. Please raise your hand. I will call on you. Please state your name and your affiliation. Yes, sir.
Tom Rousey with ABC7 here in D.C. So it sounds like you're saying the way this was done for years, every day was presenting an intolerable risk. Is that a correct characterization?
Yes, that is a correct characterization. There's a serious safety issue here, which is why we're issuing these urgent safety recommendations. Fortunately, and I am pleased that Secretary Duffy took immediate action. Now we need to see that more permanent solution.
Now that said, the alternate, you're recommending an alternate route. Couldn't that take it over homes and potentially create battles there?
That is something that the FAA has to look at as part of designating that route, which is why we're not prescribing a particular route. That is something they'll have to look at. Next question.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Grady Trimble with Fox Business. The current restrictions that Secretary Duffy put in place allow for some exceptions. Are you saying today that those exceptions should be removed and no helicopters should be able to fly on that particular route?
And for those who may not hear the question is about the current exceptions, say for presidential helicopter operations, some life-saving helicopter operations. We are not stating that. We are leaving that to the FAA. They'll have to determine what is necessary. What we are saying is that there is a safety risk here, and they need to take immediate action.
And to follow up on you said over half of the helicopters in these close, near collisions, I guess you could call them, were above the 200-foot threshold. Do you have any explanation for why that might have been the case? Was it issues with altitude instruments? Were they just ignoring the restrictions?
The question is about the half that was that we believe was over the altitude restriction for the helicopter. We'll look at that as part of our investigation. Thank you. Pete.
Please characterize how close a margin
No.
And then how angry does it make you that it took a fatal crash, the first fatal crash in the United States in decades, for that to expose this issue that was clearly baked into the airspace here?
Well, the question is, could I characterize how close 75 feet is and whether this makes me angry? First, 75 feet is very close. That is far too close of a proximity. We have stated it's an intolerable risk to aviation safety. And we have called on DOT, FAA to take action. With respect to how angry it makes me, it does make me angry, but it also makes me feel incredibly devastated for families that are grieving because they lost loved ones. It shouldn't take a tragedy like this to occur. Unfortunately, one did, and so we are calling on action, but there clearly were indicators where safety trending could have occurred. Fortunately, we have a secretary in place that is taking safety very seriously, but it shouldn't take a tragedy to require immediate action.
Would you call this an oversight, given the proximity of the glide path and the helicopter route?
The question is whether I would call this an oversight. I would call it, I mean, it's stronger than an oversight, right? The data we have pulled is from a voluntary safety reporting system that FAA could have used any time. That data from October 2021 through December 2024, they could have used that information any time to determine that we have a trend here and a problem here and looked at that route. That didn't occur. Which is why we're taking action today. But unfortunately, people lost lives and loved ones are grieving. Sir?
Yeah, Chair Hamady, Adam Tuss, Channel 4 here in D.C. Have you looked at the frequency of flights at Reagan National Airport, the number of aircraft that are landing day after day, and possibly, could make some recommendations there? Is that something you guys could do?
The question is on the number of flights that are landing and departing from DCA and whether we're taking a look at that. Certainly, everything is on the table right now as far as our investigation is concerned, and we will look at that. We're certainly going to look at separation distances between landing and departing aircraft as part of our investigation. That's something we would look at, but that's still to be done. Yes?
BBC News, Nomina Iqbal. I wonder if you could tell us, could this have been prevented if there'd been more staffing?
The question is, could this been prevented if there was more staffing? I assume you mean in air traffic control. That is part of our investigation and is part of the analysis phase of our investigation. Right now, we are collecting facts on air traffic control. In our preliminary report today, we will mention that there were 5 controllers on position. There were 9 there, not in the cab, but in the tower. Some in the break room. We do know that the helicopter and the local position were combined at 3:40 p.m., so we are taking a look at that. We do not have any evidence that anybody left. In fact, the controller came back into rotation around 4:27 p.m. We also know that the flight data position and the clearance delivery positions were also combined for the entire day, which is not abnormal.
If I can just follow up, I mean, you're making these recommendations, but you've got the White House and DOJ potentially making cuts, particularly to air traffic controllers. So I wonder how worried and concerned you might be about.
The question is about, again, air traffic control staffing and any sort of cuts. I don't want to speak for the Secretary. I believe they have a hiring exemption for air traffic controllers. I see his posts on X daily calling for people to apply for air traffic controller positions. So they are actively hiring. And so, that is something he is doing right now. Yeah. Yes.
Hi, Will Guy, Midair. I'm curious, as a part of your investigation, if you'll be looking into other airspace in the states where helicopter routes might conflict with, regular traffic, and
Yeah, the question is whether we're looking at other airspace where there can be encounters between airplanes and helicopters. That may be part of our investigation. Certainly, we've collected the information. I am pleased that FAA has announced that they've already begun looking at other airports across the nation. I would encourage them to continue to do that work. Yes, David.
Chair Hamady, two questions for you. One, did the board consider making a recommendation to the military to have ADSB out on all helicopter flights in the area? Because we know that was not operating at the time. And secondly, is it a fair read of these recommendations that it will allow some helicopter traffic that has been previously prohibited, right? So helicopters that are currently not allowed in that area, if flights are only using runway 1, will be able to operate?
The last question is about runway 1. Yes, our recommendations are focused on runway 15 and runway 33 and prohibiting that helicopter traffic when those are in operation. We did not address runway 1. That can continue. And your other question on ADSB. We still have a lot of work to do on ADSB. We know that the CRJ had ADSB out. It did not have ADSB in. We do have a lot of work to do with the Black Hawk, not just with this Black Hawk, but we are actually looking fleet-wide at the Black Hawk at ADSB. Number one, we have not been able to rule out that in this helicopter we're looking at whether it was installed correctly, whether it was programmed correctly, whether there was some sort of malfunction, or whether it was turned off. But we're not just leaving that to this helicopter. We're looking at it more broadly to really understand how the Army deals with ADSB. Yes.
We have Freedom Gray Television. In that 13-year span, we said there was at least one air traffic collision avoidance triggered each month. Can you give some context as to what that national average is like for other large airports or other airports near military operations?
The question is on the TCAS alerts that we found at least one every month from 2011 through 2024, and could we characterize that more nationally at other airports? Right now we're focused on DCA. FAA is looking at other airports, and we are pleased with that and encouraging them to do that. We also may look at other airports as part of this investigation.
2 more questions?
Yep. We'll count that as one.
Okay, thank you. So going back to the collision and evidence, it seems like there's a lot of red flags. Did anybody raise like a red alarm before, or is it just came up because of this incident? And then going back to the controllers and combining, do you have any insight into how often that happens, especially at DCA towers?
Well, with respect to, there's a question on the controllers and how often they combine. I will say the combined positions of flight data and clearance delivery, as we understand it, is pretty normal. With respect to helicopter and local traffic, there are standards that FAA has in place on when they can combine them, and they have to seek certain permissions. But as far as data on how often, that is something we are looking at as part of our investigation. And I'm sorry, your second question was?
Going back to the 1 a month, that type of thing.
Oh.
Did anybody raise an alarm, or did it just come up because you did the detail?
Regarding, did anyone raise alarm regarding the TCAS RAs that went off at least once a month? Here's how I'll answer it. The 15,214 occurrences that we identified as close proximity events with the help of FAA, close proximity events between helicopters and airplanes between October 2021 and December 2024. Some of those is information they obtain. A number of those are through voluntary safety reporting systems. So that means somebody did flag it and call it in.
Is that the NAS or the SAS, or what's the reporting system for that?
Well, ASAP reporting system? Yeah, it's the ASAP reporting system. Yep.
Max Marcella from DC News Now. You mentioned that there was a risk if these permanent changes were not put in place what would your message be to the many, many people flying in or out of DCA today and in the near future?
Well, today, though, with the exception, the question is, what is my message for people flying in and out of DCA? I assume you mean about safety? I just flew with my daughter out of DCA on a CRJ with PSA Airlines. Aviation is incredibly safe. DCA is where I always fly out of. I say often that your biggest risk is in your personal vehicle when you're going to and from the airport. Aviation is safe. However, there are safety issues in areas where we need to improve to make sure that we are at zero. And so that is the role of the NTSB in investigating. This is why we issue urgent safety recommendations.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
To continue monitoring the progress of the investigation, please check ntsb.gov. Thank you.
Can we stay here for a bit?
Good afternoon, and thanks for coming. I'm Eric Weiss with NTSB Media Relations. NTSB Chairman Jennifer Homendy, Homendy, and Recorders Branch Chief Sean Payne, Payne, will walk us through the accident sequence of the January 29th Midair collision near Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport. They will then take questions and answers. No analysis of the preliminary investigative information will be provided, and we will not be speculating about the probable cause. As always, you can follow this and other NTSB investigations on our website, ntsb.gov, as well as on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and X at NTSB_newsroom. And reporters can always contact us through email at mediarelations@ntsb.gov. Chairman?
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. The on-scene portion of our investigation into the January 29th Midair collision near Reagan National Airport has wrapped up. We have the perishable evidence we need, so we want to provide an investigative update and talk about next steps. Let's begin with some information on the Black Hawk's route and then proceed through the accident sequence. This particular flight was a check ride for the pilot flying the Black Hawk. Generally, a check ride is a practical exam that a pilot must pass to be qualified to perform specific aircrew or mission duties. The Army does 3 types of check rides: instrument, annual, and night vision goggles. This was a combined annual and night vision goggle check ride. We believe the helicopter crew was likely wearing night vision goggles throughout the flight. Given the nature of the flight, additionally, had they been removed, the crew was required to have a discussion about going unaided. Let me repeat that. Had they been removed, the crew was required to have a discussion about going unaided. There is no evidence on the cockpit voice recorder or CVR of such a discussion. On this chart, you'll see the routes they were generally following: helicopter route 1 to helicopter route 4. These routes are designated by the Federal Aviation Administration, or FAA, and although you see blue lines, there are no defined boundaries to these routes. You'll note on the chart that pilots are expected to maintain the maximum altitude charted when ceiling permits, unless otherwise instructed by air traffic control. The maximum altitudes along helicopter Route 1 are 1,300 feet between Cabin John and Chain Bridge, 1,000 feet at Chain Bridge, 700 just after Chain Bridge, 300 at the Key Bridge, and 200 feet just south of Memorial Bridge. Now I'm going to read some preliminary investigative information, which is derived from a variety of electronic and other sources as of 1 p.m. today. About 8:15 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, the CRJ left 37,000 feet pressure altitude for an initial descent. At 8:30, the Black Hawk began traveling generally southbound after maneuvering near Laytonsville, Maryland. CVR audio from the Black Hawk indicated the instructor pilot was the pilot monitoring and transmitting on the radio, and the pilot was the pilot flying. At 8:33:41, the Black Hawk crew requested helicopter route 1 to 4 to Davison Army Airfield, which the tower controller approved. At 8:38:39, the Black Hawk reached the intersection of the D.C. Beltway and the Potomac River near Carteret, Maryland. After briefly turning westbound, the Black Hawk turned back to the east and began descending as it picked up helicopter Route 1 over the Potomac River southeast toward downtown Washington, D.C. At 8:39:10, Potomac approach cleared the crew of the CRJ for the Mount Vernon Visual Runway 1 approach. At 8:40:46, the CRJ rolled out of a left turn established on the ILS localizer for runway 1 at approximately 4,000 feet pressure altitude, 170 knots, with landing gear up and flaps extended to 20 degrees. At 8:43:06, the CRJ crew made initial contact with DCA Tower. The tower controller then asked if the crew could switch to runway 33. The CRJ crew agreed to switch to runway 33. At 8:43:48, the Black Hawk was about 1.1 nautical miles west of the Key Bridge. The pilot flying indicated they were at 300 feet. The instructor pilot indicated they were at 400 feet. Neither pilot made a comment discussing an altitude discrepancy. At this time, we don't know why there was a discrepancy between the two. That's something that the investigative team is analyzing. At 8:44:27, as the Black Hawk approached the Key Bridge, the instructor pilot indicated the Black Hawk was at 300 feet, descending to 200 feet. Between 8:44:41 and 8:44:45, the CRJ crew selected 30 degrees of flaps and then 45 degrees of flaps. At 8:44:49, the CRJ landing gear were down and locked. The aircraft was fully configured for landing about 6.2 nautical miles south of the airport. At 8:45:27, the autopilot was disconnected, and the CRJ began a shallow right turn off the runway 1 localizer at a radio altitude of approximately 1,700 feet and an airspeed of 134 knots. This occurred about 5 nautical miles south of the airport. At 8:45:30, the Black Hawk passed over the Memorial Bridge. The instructor pilot told the pilot flying that they were at 300 feet and needed to descend. The pilot flying said they would descend to 200 feet. At 8:45:58, the Black Hawk then crossed over the Washington Tidal Basin and followed the Washington Channel consistent with helicopter Route 1. It is now approximately 2 minutes before the collision. At 8:46:01, a radio transmission from the tower was audible on the CRJ CVR, informing the Blackhawk that traffic just south of the Wilson Bridge was a CRJ at 1,200 feet circling to runway 33. CVR data from the Blackhawk indicated that the portion of the transmission stating the CRJ was circling may not have been received by the Blackhawk crew. We hear the word circling in ATC communications, but we do not hear the word circling on the CVR of the Blackhawk. The recorders group is evaluating this right now. At 8:46:08, the Blackhawk crew responded. They had the traffic in sight and requested visual separation, which was approved by DCA Tower. At 8:46:29, the CRJ crew received a 1,000-foot automated call-out. At 8:46:47, DCA Tower cleared other jet traffic on runway 1 for immediate departure with no delay. At 8:47:27, or 32 seconds before impact, the Blackhawk passed the southern tip of Haines Point. A second later, the CRJ began a left roll to turn to final on runway 33. The CRJ was at a radio altitude of 516 feet and 133 knots. At 8:47:29, the CRJ crew received a 500-foot automated call-out. At 8:47:39, or 20 seconds before impact, a radio transmission from the tower was audible on both CVRs, asking the Blackhawk crew if the CRJ was in sight. Audible in the ATC radio transmission was a conflict alert in the background. At 8:47:40, the CRJ crew received an automated traffic advisory on the TCAS system stating traffic, traffic. TCAS is the Traffic Alert and Collision Avoidance System on the CRJ. At 8:47:42, or 17 seconds before impact, a radio transmission from the tower was audible on both CVRs, directing the Blackhawk to pass behind the CRJ. CVR data from the Blackhawk indicated that the portion of the transmission that stated pass behind the may not have been received by the Blackhawk crew. Transmission was stepped on by a 0.8-second mic key from the Blackhawk. The Blackhawk was keying the mic to communicate with ATC. In response, at 8:47:44, the Blackhawk crew indicated that traffic was in sight and requested visual separation, which was approved by DCA Tower. The instructor pilot then told the pilot flying they believed ATC was asking for the helicopter to move left toward the east bank of the Potomac. At 8:47:52, or 7 seconds before impact, the CRJ rolled out on final for runway 33. The CRJ was at a radio altitude of 344 feet, 143 knots. At 8:47:58, or 1 second before impact, the CRJ began to increase its pitch, reaching about 9 degrees nose up at the time of collision. FDR data show the CRJ elevators were deflected near their maximum nose-up travel. The last radio altitude recorded for the CRJ was 313 feet and was recorded 2 seconds prior to the collision. The CRJ pitch at this time was again 9 degrees nose up, and roll was 11 degrees left wing down. The CRJ was descending at 448 feet per minute. The radio altitude of the Blackhawk at the time of the collision was 278 feet and had been steady for the previous 5 seconds. The Black Hawk pitch at the time of the collision was about a ½ degree nose up with a left roll of 1.6 degrees. Now, examination of the wreckage will assist in determination of the exact angle of the collision. Now, we're confident with the radio altitude of the Black Hawk at the time of the collision, that was 278 feet. But I want to caution, that does not mean that's what the Black Hawk crew was seeing on the barometric altimeters in the cockpit. We are seeing conflicting information in the data, which is why we aren't releasing altitude for the Black Hawk's entire route. I'm going to turn it over to Sean Payne for an explanation of that. Sean is branch chief of the NTSB Vehicle Recorder Division.
Thank you. I'm Sean Payne. I'm branch chief of the Vehicle Recorder Division. This is the flight recorder lab at the NTSB. I can give some insight into the challenges of understanding what altitude the Black Hawk pilots would have seen on their gauges in the cockpit. You may see pictures released of showing us in the lab rebuilding the flight recorders. That's part of our job. But a bigger part is ensuring that the data that we have downloaded is true and accurate. We call this validating the data. I'm going to define some terms for altitude in a way that most audiences can understand. I may end up reading much of this verbatim as I want to be precise in my language. The first term is radio altitude. You've heard this in our other press conference before. This is a measure of the helicopter's height above terrain, in this case, the Potomac River. It is measured by bouncing a signal from the helicopter to the river. We have determined that this parameter is valid. This is good data. This gives us confidence in knowing exactly how high the helicopter was above the ground. This parameter is not the primary means the pilots would have used to determine their height during flight. The pilots are not typically navigating using radio altitude. It is often different from what they see on their primary altimeters. The next term is barometric altitude. This is typically the altitude the pilots would use while they are flying. This was not recorded on the FDR. Barometric altitude takes into account certain atmospheric conditions. This would be displayed in front of both pilots on their instrument panel. As I said, this was not recorded. The next term is barometric pressure setting. This is an adjustment that the pilots use on their primary barometric altimeters to ensure that the altimeter is set properly. This is critical. This was not recorded by the FDR. This accounts for the local pressure at the time of the flight. Again, this was not recorded by the FDR. The next term is pressure altitude. This is more of an engineering altitude that the helicopter's systems can tap into. This altitude is calibrated using what we call a standard atmospheric pressure. We have found that this parameter is not valid. This is bad data. Normally, we can use this parameter to compute the barometric altitude displayed to the pilots. Because this data is bad, we have to use other methods to make this determination. Last, the FDR does not record GPS information, so we cannot simply verify any of this with GPS information such as GPS altitude. This does not exist in the data set. We are working to determine if this bad data for pressure altitude only affected the FDR or if it was more pervasive throughout the helicopter's other systems. We will have an answer to what altitude the pilots saw on their gauges as they were flying. To examine this, we will use a combination of methods. First, we have already started working with Sikorsky, Collins Aviation, and the Army to retrieve engineering documentation to understand how this may have affected other helicopter systems. Next, because we cannot turn to the FDR for this information, the wreckage of the helicopter needs to be examined. We need to look at the remains of the pedostatic and air data system. I must stress that these systems were badly damaged in the accident, and this will be difficult. Last, we will need to look at the altimeters themselves and determine their independent functionality. I'd like to stress that we've just completed the on-scene phase of the investigation. We need to follow our process and be meticulous. Ultimately, this work will determine the altitude displayed to the pilots and will be included in our final report. I'll pass it back to the Chairman.
Thanks, John. What I just read, we are going to publish that online so I'm not going to take specific questions going back to certain times that I've already read. I think that can get very confusing, and so please refer to what we do post online. I do want to make a few corrections and also provide some additional information on a couple of other issues. First, the ATC group has been looking at the radio frequencies. The airplane and the helicopter were both on two different VHF frequencies, not UHF. Also, just a correction, Metropolitan Police Department recovered the Black Hawk CVR and FDR, not the FBI. I do want to provide a little bit of information on ADSB out for the Black Hawk. ADSB stands for Automatic Dependent Surveillance Broadcast. So the helicopter was equipped with and capable of transmitting ADSB out. We don't know why it wasn't transmitting. What we'll have to look at is the installation of the equipment. We'll have to look at programming. We'll have to look at whether there was some sort of equipment malfunction or if the ADSB was turned off. So there are a lot of people are asking about, was it turned off? There are other things we have to rule out first. The team is going to do a visibility study. The visibility study, we're going to do a laser scan of the cockpits of an exemplar CRJ. We're going to also laser scan an exemplar cockpit of an exemplar Black Hawk. And we're going to take that information as well as information from examination of the wreckage, different seating positions, different heights, different eye positions, also taking into account night vision goggles. And we're going to do a pretty in-depth visibility study, which we do often, and see if we can demonstrate, which we will be able to do on a software program, what the pilots of the Black Hawk could and could not see. Now, we will begin moving the wreckage from DCA to a secure location over the next week. And that's all I have for now. I am going to take questions. Again, I'm not going to take questions on specific times that I read through in the Black Hawk route or in the CRJ as it was moving to runway 33, but all of that will be online at ntsb.gov, and you can find that. So I will take questions as I call you. Please raise your hand, state your name and your affiliation. Tom.
Madam Chair, Tom Costello with NBC News. Thank you for the update. Do we understand correctly, you're looking into the possibility that there may have been, I underscore may have been, a malfunction in terms of the accuracy of the altimeter readings inside the cockpit for the Black Hawk helicopter?
One more time.
Do I understand correctly, you're looking into the possibility that there may have been bad data and therefore inaccurate readings inside the cockpit of the chopper for altitude for the pilots to read?
That's correct. We are looking at the possibility of there may be bad data. We're looking at, were they seeing something different in the cockpit that differs from the FDR data, which was radio altimeter?
In other words, they may have thought they're at one altitude when in truth they were at a different altitude.
It's possible, but we have a lot of work to do till we get to that. Pete
Munting with CNN. How critical is the finding that the crew could have been wearing night vision goggles, and how much will that factor into your investigation?
So the question is, how critical is the finding that the crew could have been wearing night vision goggles? That is, part of our investigation where it's going to be a factor in our visibility study. We're going to have to see what was possible for them to see at the time leading up to the collision and the accident sequence.
Is there anything in the voice recorder indicating that the crew of the Black Hawk saw the impending collision?
Is there anything in the voice recorder that the crew of the Black Hawk could see or tell that there was an impending collision? We do not have any indication that the Black Hawk crew would have seen that.
Paul Wagner with News 4. Based on possibility that they were wearing these night vision goggles. We've heard from people who wear them that it may affect your peripheral vision. So if the plane is coming into 33 and they're coming down the river, that possibly the peripheral vision may have been affected to see that plane off to the left?
The question is visibility and night vision goggles. This is exactly why we do a visibility study, and we'll test that as part of our study. But time will tell. Just to level set here, we're only a couple of weeks out, and we have a lot of work to do. That will be a part of the work.
David Gilbert, Washington Post. You mentioned the CRJ got a traffic advisory before the collision. Do you know what aircraft triggered that traffic advisory? And do you know if it in fact was the Black Hawk or some other aircraft?
Do we know if the traffic advisory that was received by the CRJ crew was the Black Hawk? That's something that our ATC group is analyzing.
Lydia, News Nation, hi. My question is about air traffic control's message to the Black Hawk saying that they should pull behind the passenger plane. You're saying that didn't get through to the Black Hawk, or are you saying that is what's being investigated, or it did get through and they weren't able to accommodate that?
So the instructions from ATC were to pass behind the CRJ. That transmission was interrupted. It was stepped on. We do not have evidence on the CVR of the Black Hawk that they may have not received pass behind because the mic key. They were communicating with air traffic control at the time.
Did that full message come through from air traffic control, like pass behind the passenger plane, or was it just pass behind and then it got cut off in the Black Hawk?
Pass behind was not communicated.
And
Yeah.
what were the next words?
Actually, it was communicated by ATC. It was not heard on the Black Hawk CVR. Is that clear?
I think the clarification of the Black Hawk not receiving an air traffic control and making it through, was the passenger plane aware of the Black Hawk even in the area being told of this? Was that something that would even be on their frequencies? I know this is a second-by-second moment, so I don't know who got what.
So the CRJ crew can hear air traffic control and communications from air traffic control. The Black Hawk crew can also hear communications from air traffic control, but they can't hear communications from each other back to air traffic control. So it's half the communication. Yes.
Thank you, Chair Holland. Grady Trimble with Fox Business. I know it's early in the investigation, and I know that the FAA controls the airspace around DCA. But at this point, would you say that the temporary restriction of helicopter flights is the right move, and would you advocate for a permanent restriction of those flights?
Well, I do want to congratulate the Secretary Duffy for taking action immediately to restrict helicopter traffic, except for certain circumstances, life-saving flights and presidential flights. So I think they took the right safety action. We will have to, as we go through our investigation, look at the accident sequence and take our investigative information and determine what next steps should be done. It's too early for us to say whether it should be permanent. However, that's certainly something that the Secretary and the FAA can do on their own.
And because it will be you guys who put the safety recommendations forward in the end, are there any others right now that would make flying into that particular airport safer?
Yeah, so here's what I'm going to say. On aviation is the safest mode of transportation. I say this often. You are at greater risk getting into your car to and from the airport. On our nation's roads are 95% of all transportation deaths. 95%. We're talking 43,000 people are dying on our nation's roads annually, millions more injured. Aviation is incredibly safe. With respect to any safety recommendations that may come along or any safety deficiencies that we might identify, one thing I will say is our investigative process, we don't wait till the end of our investigation to issue something that may impact a safety deficiency. So, for example, we will issue an urgent safety recommendation if we see that something needs to be acted on immediately. We won't wait till the end of the investigation. We won't wait till the end to issue recommendations in the final report. We will take action. We will issue an urgent safety recommendation if we need to. So that's open right now in all areas.
Last question.
Yes.
Patrick Terps with Scripps News. There's been a lot of talk from aviation experts that maybe the crew on the CRJ, or on the Black Hawk, rather, is looking at the wrong plane. Can you talk about whether you've seen anything that would support that theory or oppose it?
I've read these reports. It's too early to tell. We're going to have to do our visibility study to look at all possibilities of what the crew might have been seeing. So more to come on that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.